Hey, whatever happened to climate change? Is anybody still talking about that? And can we actually do anything to save the planet? Well, that's the conversation we're gonna have now. Joining me is Karenna Gore. She's the founder and executive director of Center for Earth Ethics. We're gonna find out what that is. She's a teaching professor of practice at Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and she's the author of Lighting the Way: 9 Women Who Changed Modern America, and she's about to speak at COP30. We'll tell you, if you don't know, we'll tell you what COP30 is as well. Karenna, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. How are you?
Wonderful. I'm super happy that you're here. So, Karenna, you do something fascinating, Earth Ethics. So for those who are unfamiliar, what is that?
Well, Earth Ethics is the discernment of how to live in right relationship with the living planet. It is a field of thought that really looks at how do we understand the conditions of life that we're in, what are our moral obligations across time, space, and even species in order to live in balance and harmony and create the conditions for the flourishing of all.
No. Now we're having a super interesting conversation. We'll come back to climate change in a minute, okay? But time, space, and species. Okay, this is now we got the Star Trek area. You're in my ballpark now. Okay, so tell me about how Earth Ethics is related to time and space. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me say that a friend of mine with the Church of Sweden once said that in any room where there are decisions being made about climate, there should be 3 empty chairs for those who are at the same time most impacted, least responsible for the harm, and also least likely to have a voice in the decisions that are being made. And therefore, 1, for the poor and marginalized people, 2, for future generations, and 3, for all non-human life. And if you think about it, if we had looked out for those 3 categories, we wouldn't be in this perilous situation as a whole. So it's not only about what is fair to each, but it is really about a way of life that has more wisdom to it. And one of the things we do at Center for Earth Ethics, we're based at Union Theological Seminary. We're affiliated with Columbia Climate School, but we're really based at the seminary. And so with a great history of interreligious dialogue and moral philosophy. So we draw from faith and wisdom traditions across the board to try to bring to bear some of those concepts and principles and an ethos of sort of belonging, community, and culture. And actually, that has been some of what people have felt is missing in the conversation that takes place around a lot of the COPs, because it can be quite technical, when in fact, it's really about the meaning of life.
It is, that's all. That's why I'm fascinated by it. So, but again, guys, COP doesn't mean COP. We'll get to that in a minute. It's a climate change conference. But so you had me on 2 out of 3. In fact, I think it's brilliant. But I'll tell you why I disagree on the 3rd one. So having a seat for poor and disadvantaged folks is brilliant because you're right. I mean, they're never represented. They don't have lobbyists. They don't have the money to show up in that room where the decision makers are. They are the most forgotten people in America and in the world. So that's great to think about it that way. Who's not in the room, right? Future generations also brilliant. Makes sense. And we all agree across race, class, everything you can imagine, because those are all of our kids, right? And our grandkids. And so the 3rd one, you're gonna say, wait, you disagree with me on non-humans? Yeah, I'm a humanist. Okay, and so that's why, though, ironically, that leads me to this question, because my wife one day decided that she was gonna relax about climate change. Now, this is the most ironic thing you've ever heard, okay? I said, why? And she said, I realized I care so much about the earth, and the earth is just gonna shake us off. It's gonna be totally fine. It's us that's gonna have the problems, right? And so as a humanist, I'm much more worried about climate change than earth should be. So that's my sense of it. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think one of basically, we like to look at the root causes of the climate crisis, because if you're just acting at the level of effect, you're never going to solve a problem. So we can talk about the impacts, and of course we need to focus on adaptation and dealing with how the effects of the the stronger storms and the heat waves and the droughts and the wildfires. But if we don't look at the level of cause, then we're not going to solve the problem. So at the one level of cause, I like how Gus Speth puts it. There are two modern megatrends of pollution into the atmosphere, especially those greenhouse gases that cause climate change, and there's more to say about that. But also depletion of carbon sinks that are also habitats for many species, including human beings. But that's on the material plane, that level of cause. So what's the deeper level of cause? Those modern megatrends are happening because of human perception and behavior. The deeper level of cause is the illusion that we are separate from nature. And if you look in faith and wisdom traditions, there, especially indigenous traditions, there are many teachings about how, in fact, we are very much in an interconnected web of life. So if you're a humanist, think about what is food, right? We eat food. Food is other living species. That's what that is, So if we think about the homes for our food, that's habitats. It's also, of course, agriculture. We now live in a society in which most of our food system is boiled down to just these monocropped, industrial agriculture. But even that is being affected by climate change. And of course, of all the wild species that much of the world, does still rely on, and the smallholder farmers, that's also non-human life. So I think that these are sort of the deep level of the illusion of our separation from nature is actually the thing that's most important to break through on, because it's what's causing the crisis in the first place.
Yeah, I didn't know that I was signing up for a wonderful philosophical conversation, and that's what we're in the middle of, and I love it because you're challenging me on my selfishness and I got news for you. No, I'm gonna win on that. I'm deeply selfish. Okay, so no, seriously, like the case that I make is for if we want to survive, we should do something about climate change, because whether the earth is okay or not, we're gonna get wiped out if 99% of the world's scientists are correct. It's only a matter of time, right? But of course, you make a great point about how interconnected we are with the other animals in nature. And of course I know that, but again, it goes to my selfishness. So when we started losing the bees at an alarming rate, I was panicking because we're gonna need them, right? Without the bees and the fish and etc., we're all gonna be in a world of trouble. And it's, to me, again, as a humanist, I'm amazed that people don't see how we're part of nature. What do you think we're part of? Of course we're part of nature. I mean, to me, and again, this is ironic because you deal so much in faith and I'm an atheist. But as an atheist, I think I'm an ape. Like literally, I'm in the ape family, right? And so as an ape, you need a lot of things from nature, including what you eat, including what you breathe. And so you'd be nuts to damage that environment because it's your environment that you live in. So we come back to the same place. But one last thing about this before we go on to discussing cops and whether they're good or bad, is, as you said indigenous, I was thinking, man, this sounds so much like Native American philosophy, right? And I remember when I was a young meathead and we learned that the Native Americans were one with nature and all that. I remember thinking like, yeah, back when I was a Republican, like, yeah, right, I bet, yeah, sure. Why do we think crazy things? Anyways, then later I grew up, matured, and did a little reading and learning, etc. And it turns out, yeah, of course, they hadn't figured out a lot better than us. And now look, to be fair to us, they lived in a much simpler world with smaller number of people, etc. But the way they managed their environment, it was a lot to learn from. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes, I agree, and it's been a wonderful doorway to knowledge and understanding, to listen to the perspective of indigenous peoples in this country and around the world. And one reason for that is that it really reveals the assumptions of modern industrial society, and especially those societies and cultures like where I grew up, that is definitely rooted in a settler colonial mindset and dynamic. And there is a theory that even the most secular people, even the most atheist people, that they might have somewhat of their mindset informed by a distortion of a Judeo-Christian idea of dominion, that was so ingrained in the way in which folks of European descent settled in the way that they did. Let me just say, in the United States of America, that's my context. I felt when I learned that, when I understood that what was being conquest, domination, coming down on was actually a way of life that took for granted a long-term management of an ecosystem. So, for example, this concept of 7 generations that comes from the Haudenosaunee, that better known as the Iroquois, that were part of this region that I'm in right now. I'm in New York City, Lenape, Haudenosaunee, and that this concept that every decision that is made of any importance should be made with 7 generations ahead in mind. And actually, in some interpretations, it's backwards and forwards, and that should be kept in mind. That is really like the antithesis of the very short-term mentality that our economies run on. So that's one example, and in that there's also that interrelationship and responsibility to the other species that comprise the food, that also take care of the habitat, and for example, beavers that help with erosion and to maintain wetlands. There are different species can play different roles in ways that benefit each other. My friend Lila June Johnston, who is Dene, better known as Navajo, talks about humans can be a keystone species, what's known as a keystone species, whereby we live in a way that benefits all of life. And if we actually start to blend in here and harmonize with nature, it's like we belong here. Whereas our species en masse is really increasing the scale and the pace with which we're destroying our own habitat, which doesn't say much for our intelligence. So if we're gonna solve this problem, we need to be drawing from a different source of intelligence, a different kind of wisdom. And I think indigenous peoples have a great deal to offer in that regard.
Yeah, so it's funny how there's always 2 ways to look at something. I look at humans as apex predators, so a little bit different, right? But even so, even if you're the most apex predator in the world, it doesn't matter, because you still need an ecosystem, you still need an environment, you still need all of that. If you don't have the beavers, then the land is gonna sink from underneath you. If you don't have the bees, there's gonna be no pollination. So it's not about being a tough guy, it's about survival. So you can look at it in 2 different ways and still get to the same conclusion. Editor's note, I wrote a paper about Iroquois and the Lenape when I was growing up in New Jersey. Okay, all right, so, and about settling and conquering, the Turks would know a thing or two about that. So I've been on that end of it too. But if we keep going about philosophy, we'll never get out. So tell me about COP30. I know you're speaking there. For the folks at home that don't know, what is it?
Okay, so COP is one of these acronyms that doesn't very often get defined. So it's Conference of the Parties, and it's the parties to what? So the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So actually, this whole mechanism whereby our species is starting to face up to the fact that we're having a collective impact on the planet that really is changing it and threatening our health and well-being, and is already actually having destructive effects, particularly on the most vulnerable. The whole way that we can get our heads around this and do something about it is through the world coming together, because the atmosphere is shared. And so this happened in 1992 in Rio. So one exciting thing about COP30 is that it's going back to Brazil, this time to Belém. But in 1992, with the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also the acronym is UNFCCC, it began these annual gatherings whereby nations get together and talk about what to do. Basically, the intent initially was, well, we need to have scientific studies. We need to bring the best of our ability to actually study this and figure out what is going on, what are the causes, and what to do about it. And then, of course, there are negotiations after 29 COPs, there's been, of course, a lot of critique of the process, but we do now know what we need to do, what the issue is. And COP 30 in Belém is another such occasion. And this time, actually, so the Paris Agreement was a big breakthrough in 2015, COP 21, whereby there were nationally determined commitments to say what your emissions reductions would be, and so on. Talked about adaptation, mitigation, and climate finance. So written into the Paris Agreement, there was something called a stock take, global stock take, and what that meant was that people had to come back, the parties had to come back and report in about how they were doing on those commitments. And that was largely very important, but largely technical. So in this year, in the Brazilian COP 30 leadership, and particularly a woman named Marina Silva, the Minister of Environment and Climate of Brazil, Marina Silva, who's a very compelling and brave, wonderful leader, in my opinion, had an idea which was embraced and became an official thing. It's a new initiative. It's called the Global Ethical Stocktake. So what that means is that we need to bring into the center of the conversation, not just the questions of where we are technically with regard to mitigation, adaptation, finance, but what is holding us back? What are the reasons why people are not heeding the science? What can we do differently? What elements of culture can we bring in to help communicate and motivate people in this regard? So my role is actually supporting the Global Ethical Stocktake. She asked me to be a co-leader, particularly for North America, and that is what I'm doing. I will be at COP. There's going to be a Global Ethical Stocktake pavilion. There's going to be, there will be programs. We'll be lifting up some of the concepts, some of the voices that have been engaged in civil society, where we've had lots of dialogues, one official per region, and then many self-organized dialogues. And that's what I'll be doing there. And you can check it out on centerforearthethics.org, our website. We're gonna have next week a whole gallery of voices that are lifting ethical and moral, spiritual, cultural concepts and ways of communicating about this issue.
Okay, so I'm gonna go on a little soapbox here, so you're gonna have to bear with me on it for a second. But first, I want people to know that COP 30 is happening between November 10th, so it's coming up, and November 21st. It's called, COP just means Conference of the Parties. It's over 200 nations getting together, so that's important. But I'm gonna ask Karenna in a second, yeah, but are we actually doing it? But the soapbox part is, again, two different ways of looking at the same thing. Karenna talks about ethics, and the right wing in this country might talk about family values. But really, that's very similar, right? Values, ethics. And so then what's causing the division if we all agree that we should be ethical and have the right values? What's causing the division is honestly corporations. And so in this case, the oil companies. So the oil companies have, as with any company, revenue and cost, right? And so their revenue is obvious. They make an enormous amount of money. They're among the most profitable companies in the world, yet we still give them $35 billion in subsidies every year, which is maddening, but a different issue. In this case, one of the costs that they have is creating climate change. And then that makes storms much more severe, and one of the many, many things that it does. And then guess who pays for the storms? We do. So they put their cost onto us. Now, normally you wouldn't be able to do that in a democracy because your representatives would stand up for you. But unfortunately, because of money in politics, our representatives don't work for us, they work for the oil companies, and they help them manufacture doubt. Well, I don't know, is it climate change or is it not? Is it warming or cooling? Well, don't worry about it, let us just keep making the money, and you keep paying the cost, okay? So now, Karenna, you're of course perfectly familiar with that, but that's all a prelude to the question of, yes, but how are we doing so far? Because those guys are very, very powerful. And unfortunately, Trump has won the presidency, and one of his slogans is "Drill, baby, drill," which is not going to help any situation. And according to the Paris Agreement you mentioned, we were supposed to limit global temperatures to only a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. How are we doing on that? And eventually, I'm going to ask you: is there any hope out there, given how it seems like America's basically pulled out of any of this?
Well, we're not doing well by a lot of the metrics, some of which you mentioned. It's record high fossil fuel consumption, record high fossil fuel company profits. In the Global Ethical Stocktake official dialogue that we did for the North America region, that was brought up in several ways. Sephora Berman was there talking about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. David Suzuki of Canada called for banning fossil fuel lobbyists. There's a more and more clear recognition that it is not just reliance on fossil fuels themselves, it's reliance on fossil fuel money in so many institutions. And it is the influence that is really a major obstacle standing in the way. So I think it's very important to name that. I also want to say though that in the field of ethics, so ethics is basically the discernment of right and wrong and the implications for our behavior as individuals and as collectives. And it is something that undergirds society in many ways. Our laws and social norms, but ethics is most powerful when there is a deeply felt and more widely shared sense of right and wrong that is out of step with both laws and social norms. And that was the case in times past, like the abolition of slavery, the movement for the abolition of slavery. And I grew up right in the wake of the civil rights movement, from a political family from the south of this country. So I was very aware of that. And it is the case also for the climate crisis today. Most of what is causing climate change is perfectly legal and even socially encouraged. So what we have to do is we have to draw from those deeper wells of conscience. We need to work with ethics. We need to make that ethical lens very sharp and talk about it as the issue that it is, with the high moral stakes. That is the thing that's going to change it. And so that's my hope for this COP, is that we can have a shift in perception and we can start to name the real stakes with that ethical lens. And I absolutely agree that it should be in the context of the COP, which is necessarily nation states because it is the United Nations. There is increasing awareness that the drivers of harm are to be found also in these multinational corporations. And so how do we understand that? In our region, and it is different than in Africa. I was also able to be an observer at the Africa Global Ethical Stocktake Dialogue. And many people noted there's not a lot of climate denial in Africa. There is a lot of recognition of the stakes of what's happening, how many people are already suffering and dying, and how much that will continue. So we need to be standing up to those fossil fuel industry influence peddlers at this COP. And that is something I'm very interested in supporting and doing.
Okay, so then let me end on that, because, okay, but we're gonna be really behind because Trump's not gonna do anything for 3 years, right? So he's pulled us out of a lot of agreements and won't go along with, other things that we agreed to earlier, et cetera, right? So the next president then has to catch up even more, and then people are gonna complain about prices, and you're gonna, obviously you're gonna get the propaganda about the gas stoves and a million other things that they're gonna invent, right? But can we catch up? Can we take significant enough action 3 years from now to be able to actually not have the temperature rise enough so that the storms get even more severe, the oceans rise, et cetera? Because people, unfortunately in America, we don't have a global enough perspective, because we're like, oh yeah, the idea that you'd lose cities or whatever. We're losing nations, we're losing island nations. That's already happening. Just because it didn't happen to us doesn't mean that it's not happening. Plus the severe storms are happening to us all the time. right? So, okay, that impossible question of can we catch up?
Yes, I'm not the world expert on all of the technicalities, but I read what people say. The International Energy Agency says that we have all of the technology that we need to transition away from fossil fuels. We need to identify the obstacles to doing that, and we need to care more. So the fact that many people don't list that as their main concern, or don't voice it in their town hall or so on, is obviously something that we need to change. We need to lift it to the top of the agenda and keep it there. It's so intertwined with other issues. The Lancet does these studies on health and poverty. The many others do as well. But basically, the air pollution alone caused by the burning of fossil fuels kills millions of people a year. So there are many reasons why we should be getting off of that. And I would say one last thing, which is that part of what has been so good about this global ethical stocktake is that bringing voices to the fore that aren't normally in the conversation in the United States of America. It's true that we have to face the fact that many of us are among the sector of society that bears the most responsibility for the systems that have caused this crisis, and that's very serious business morally. But also, this is a place in which there have been incredibly strong movements. The environmental justice movement, for example, and the indigenous movement. The American Indian and other aspects of it have been raising these concerns for so long with very deep and sharp analysis and insights that can be brought to the world, and they will be. We had a self-organized dialogue actually in New Orleans on the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. It was very powerful to hear from the community there. The karma there, I say karma, the cause and effect there is so tight because there's so many petrochemical industries located right around there on the Gulf Coast. There's so much health impacts from those industries. And then there's also the stronger storms that are from the impacts and the oil spills as well. So hearing from that community rising up, Sharon Levine, and others in New Orleans that were speaking in that way was really strong. We can take those voices to COP. We can take the voices from the First National People of Color Environment Conference that was in 1991. They came up with the 17 principles of environmental justice. We heard from Ben Chavis, we heard from Robert Bullard, Jackie Patterson, others that have been lifting those voices, and that will all be able. We can as Americans, we have a deep legacy in that regard that we can bring to the world, even though obviously we have an ethical embarrassment and a difficult situation with who's in charge at the moment. So I'm hoping we're going through something and we're going to come out the other side even better when it's all said and done.
You're talking about getting people from Louisiana who are affected because they have all those corporations causing all that around there, let alone globally. But excuse me, what are the chances that a severe storm would hit Louisiana? Oh, right, okay, so Karenna, you're gonna speak at COP30, and it's left me speechless apparently, and we're all gonna check it out. Tell us what your website is one more time.
Yeah, okay, well, and I'll be at the pavilion. I'll be at the Global Ethical Stocktake Pavilion speaking, and I'll be at the TED Countdown House, actually. We have an event which is going to be on November 14th at 11. The website is centerforearthethics.org, and it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Cenk. I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. And look, we talked about how currently we have a guy who doesn't care much about climate change, but I think we actually can unite around this. I think we do have the same ethics and values, and I think that once people see what the real danger is, one of the dangers, by the way, is cost. And I think that for a lot of folks in this country, including our right-wing friends, when they find out that the oil companies are putting all their costs onto us, are not gonna be happy with that. Like, God, they have, in my opinion, they have robbed us blind for decade after decade. And we've got to stop that for all of our sake, financially, personally, spiritually, as you're pointing out, which is a very important point. So that we could survive. So Karenna Gore is trying to make that happen. We appreciate you so much. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.